We call it the Cradle of Civilization, a fertile plain nestled between two great rivers, where humanity first learned to build cities, to write laws, and to dream of eternity. But this land of firsts, is also a land of lasts. This is Mesopotamia. We are taught that this is where civilization began, but a closer look at the dust of millennia reveals a more brutal, more terrifying truth. This land is not a cradle, it is a graveyard, a serial killer of empires. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the world's first true superpowers. They rose from the silt, built cities that touched the heavens and commanded millions, and one by one they were annihilated, erased, swallowed by the very land that birthed them. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't a streak of bad luck. It was a pattern, a bloody, repetitive cycle. So we must ask the fundamental question, why? Why did the world's first empires in the world's most fertile land seem doomed to fail? Was it a flaw in their gods? A flaw in their kings? Or was their doom written into the very soil they farmed? A fatal flaw woven into the fabric of Mesopotamia itself. This is the story of that flaw. A deadly feedback loop of three forces that guaranteed collapse. An environment that both gives and takes. A political system built on violence, and the relentless gravity of human conflict. This is the great collapse of Mesopotamia. Act 1. The foundation of fragility. The Sumerians. Our story begins where civilization itself begins. Southern Mesopotamia, the land of Sumer, around 4000 BC. Imagine a world not of nations, but of cities. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, Umma. These were not just settlements, they were revolutionary experiments. Thousands of people living together for the first time, walls of mud brick rising against a vast empty landscape. They were not an empire, they were rivals. Scene: visuals of irrigation canals, fields of barley, transition to cracked white salt-caked earth. What brought them here? What forced this revolution? The rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates. They were a paradox, the givers of life and the bringers of chaos. To the north, the rivers were wild, cutting deep gorges, but in the south, they were slow, meandering, dumping millennia of rich silt onto a flat, arid plain. The problem was, the water was there, but the rain was not. To survive, the Sumerians engineered a miracle: large-scale irrigation. They dug canals, built levees, and diverted the water of the gods to their fields. This miracle produced the first great agricultural surplus in history. It fed priests, kings, artists, and armies. It built the first ziggurats. But this miracle, it had a price. A slow-moving curse they could not see until it was too late. In this hot, arid climate, the sun beat down on the irrigation water. The water evaporated, but the salt, dissolved within it, did not. Year after year, decade after decade, the salt was left behind. The soil, once miraculously fertile, grew toxic. This is salinization. It is the slow, creeping death of agriculture. We have the records. Archaeologists have analyzed ancient field data. In 2400 BC, in the Sumerian city of Girsu, The fields were roughly 50% wheat and 50% barley. Barley is a hardier crop, more tolerant of salt. By 2100 BC, only 300 years later, wheat, a high-value preferred crop, had vanished. The soil was too poisonous for it. They were left with only low-yield, salty barley. By 1700 BC, the harvest yields in southern Mesopotamia had collapsed by over 65%. The agricultural heartland of the world had poisoned itself. This environmental collapse was the ticking clock beneath everything, but it was not the only flaw. Seen, visuals of the stelae of the vultures, showing soldiers in formation trampling enemies. The second flaw was political. The Sumerian cities were in a state of perpetual, draining warfare. They weren't fighting for a grand vision, they were fighting over water and land boundaries. The most famous example, a 150-year war between the cities of Lagash and Umma. They fought over a single strip of irrigated land. The Stele of the Vultures is a monument to this victory, a brutal record of the king of Lagash leading his phalanx, his chariots rolling over the crushed bodies of his neighbors. This wasn't strength, it was weakness. Each war drained the treasury, pulled farmers from their fields, and left the city walls vulnerable. The Sumerians, as brilliant as they were politically fragmented. They spent their energy fighting each other while their own fields were dying beneath their feet. Sumer was the first, and it provides our first lesson. A civilization that cannot manage its resources and cannot unify against its own worst impulses is doomed. The Sumerians didn't fall to a great external invader. They starved themselves. They tore themselves apart. And in doing so, they created a power vacuum, one that would be filled with a man with a new, terrifying idea. Act 2. The Brittle Empire, the Akkadians. Out of the chaos of the warring Sumerian cities, one man rises, Sargon. He was not a king. He was, according to legend, a cupbearer, an outsider. But Sargon had an idea that would change the world forever. He looked at the bickering cities of Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, and he saw their flaw. Why just rule one city when you could rule all of them? Around 2334 BC, Sargon the Great unleashed his armies. He conquered Sumer, city by city, but he did not stop. He marched north, east, and west, forging the world's first professional, standing army. This was not a city-state. This was something new. This was the Akkadian Empire. Sargon's model was built on two principles: military conquest and loyal governors. He tore down the walls of the cities he conquered, a symbolic and practical act of submission. He installed his own family members and loyalists as rulers, and he demanded one thing above all: tribute. This was the first experiment in imperial rule, and it was revolutionary. Sargon created trade networks, standardized weights and measures, and built a state that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. But Sargon's experiment had a fatal flaw. His empire was not built on unity. It was not built on shared culture or belief or prosperity. It was built on force. Scene. Visuals of Akkadian art, strong, militaristic, rigid. contrast with earlier, more varied Sumerian art. The Sumerian cities he had conquered hated him. They remembered being independent. They remembered being powerful. From the moment Sargon died, his empire was rocked by constant, vicious rebellions. His son, Rimush, faced near universal revolt and was assassinated by his own court. His grandson, Naram-Sin, a brilliant and arrogant king who declared himself a god, spent his entire reign marching his army back and forth across the empire, brutally putting down one rebellion after another. The Akkadian model was brittle. It was a rule-by-bully system. It could be held together, but only by a strong king and a permanent, exhausting military effort. It had no resilience. It was a coiled spring, held down by a boot. And then the boot was lifted by a force no army could fight. Scene: stark, desolate images of drought, cracked earth, animal skeletons, sand-blasted rock. Around 2200 BC, a catastrophic climate event struck the globe. We call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, a sudden, severe, and prolonged mega-drought that lasted for 300 years. The rain-fed agriculture in the north of his empire withered and died. The irrigation-fed south, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, shrank to a trickle. The complex system of tribute and grain storage that fed Sargon's armies collapsed. The state, already weakened by endless rebellions, was hollowed out. And into this vacuum a new group emerged from the Zagros Mountains, the Gutians. The Akkadian records call them a plague, serpents of the hills, a people who knew no order. They were not a sophisticated army. They were opportunistic raiders. But in the face of a shattered empire and a starving populace, they were the final push. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first, collapsed completely. It vanished for over a century. The cities fell silent. The lesson of Akkad is the lesson of brittleness. An empire built only on military force is incredibly strong on the surface, but fragile. It has no flexibility. It cannot bend. And when the first real shock comes, a rebellion, a new invader, or a change in the climate, it does not bend. It shatters. We have witnessed the first two great experiments in empire. The Sumerians, poisoned by their own ingenuity. The Akkadians, shattered by their own brittleness. We are halfway through our journey into the graveyard of empires. Before we explore the rise of the most famous city in history, Babylon, we have a brief request. If you find value in these deep dives into our shared past and believe these stories must be told, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is what allows us to continue this work and uncover the lessons that history has left for us. Music fades back in, shifting tone to one of intellectual curiosity and order. And now, the world reboots. A new power rises on the Euphrates.
Act 3. The Empire of Order, the Babylonians. Refined, classical, mathematical. A sense of order, law, and intellectual power. History in Mesopotamia is a cycle. After the fall of Akkad, the land descended back into chaos. Warlords, petty kings, a dark age. But a new city was rising. A minor city on the Euphrates, which would become the most famous city of the ancient world, Babylon. After centuries, a new unifier emerged, a king who had studied the failures of the past. His name was Hammurabi. Hammurabi was, like Sargon, a military genius. He conquered his neighbors and forged a new empire. But he knew the lesson of Akkad. Force is not enough. A brittle empire will break. He needed something else, a new idea, a way to unite the diverse, conquered peoples of Mesopotamia, a way to rule not as a bully, but as a father, a shepherd. His solution was one of the most famous innovations in human history, the Code of Hammurabi. We often mistake the code for a simple list of laws, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But its true genius was not just the law, it was the propaganda. The code was a 7-foot-tall monument erected in public. It declared for all to see that the king was not the source of power, the gods were, and the gods had chosen Hammurabi to bring justice to the land. This was a brilliant political move. It reframed the king. He was no longer just the biggest warlord, the Akkadian bully. He was the shepherd king, the righteous administrator, the source of divine order and justice for all people. He was attempting to fix the brittleness problem of Sargon's empire by creating a shared identity, an identity based on law. And it worked, for a time. Hammurabi's old Babylonian empire became a center of art, mathematics, and trade. They charted the stars, developed a base 60 system that gives us our 60-second minute, and created a wealthy, sophisticated society. But in solving one problem, Hammurabi created a new one. His empire was centralized, it was orderly, and it was rich, incredibly rich. Babylon was not just a fortress, it was a bank. It was a beacon of wealth sitting in the middle of a very dangerous world. And this created envy. Hammurabi's dynasty after his death faced the same problem as all the others, internal rot. But their final doom came from a new direction. To the north, in the mountains of Anatolia, a new, fearsome power had emerged, the Hittites. They were masters of a new technology, the light three-man war chariot. They were fast, deadly, and they looked at Babylon with greedy eyes. In 1595 BC, the Hittite king Mursili I did the unthinkable. He marched his army 1,200 miles across deserts and mountains for one purpose, not to conquer Babylon, but to smash it. The sack of Babylon was swift and total. The Hittites broke down the gates, plundered the temples, stole the statue of the city's god, and left the greatest city in the world a burning ruin. And then, just as quickly, they left. They took their loot and went home. The old Babylonian empire was not slowly eroded, it was decapitated. A single catastrophic raid. Its centralization, its wealth, its order, all the things Hammurabi had built had simply made it a fatter, richer, more tempting target. The lesson of Babylon is the lesson of the rich target. Order and law are powerful, but they are not a shield. A state that concentrates its wealth and power in one place, however orderly, is a shining invitation to every ambitious rival, and a single well-aimed blow can bring the entire structure crashing down.
Act 4. The Empire of Fear. Oppressive, industrial. The grinding of metal, the crack of whips, a relentless, terrifying pulse. For centuries after the fall of Babylon, the land was in chaos. Hittites, Kassites, Elamites. The graveyard of empires claimed them all. But in the north, in the hard, unforgiving lands of Assyria, a new power was waiting. They had watched all the failures. They had learned all the lessons. And they would build an empire that perfected the Mesopotamian model. They are the final boss of this story, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians looked at the past and they took what worked. From Sargon, they took the professional standing army. From Hammurabi, they took the idea of a divine king and state bureaucracy. But they knew this wasn't enough. They saw the flaw in all previous models: rebellions, envy, internal weakness. The Assyrians decided to solve these problems permanently. Their solution was not law, it was not integration, it was engineered terror. The Assyrians built the most dominant, cruel, and efficient military machine the world had ever seen. They were masters of siege warfare, psychological warfare, and total war. When they conquered a city, they didn't just demand tribute, they made an example. They publicly flayed the rebellious governor and nailed his skin to the city gates. They impaled thousands of captives on spikes outside the walls. They recorded their atrocities in vivid detail and sent these terror reports to other kings as a warning. This is what happens to those who resist. The Assyrians were the first to understand that to hold an empire together, you didn't just need to conquer people's bodies, you had to conquer their minds. They perfected a new tool of statecraft: mass deportation. When they conquered a rebellious kingdom, like the Kingdom of Israel, they didn't just rule it, they unmade it. They rounded up the entire skilled population, the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and forcibly marched them hundreds of miles away, scattering them across the empire. They then imported other conquered peoples to take their place. This was a diabolical and brilliant solution to the rebellion problem. It shattered cultural identities, broke family ties, and created a terrified, displaced, and mixed population that was incapable of organizing against its masters. The Assyrian model was built on terror, efficiency, and a war machine funded by constant, profitable plunder. And for 200 years, it was unstoppable. It was the largest, most powerful empire in the world. But it was a monster, and it had two fatal flaws. First, the economic flaw. An empire built on plunder must always be plundering. It requires constant, successful, and profitable war to pay for the army that makes the war possible. The moment the empire stops expanding, the moment a war costs more than it brings in, the entire system begins to eat itself. Second, and more importantly, was the political flaw. We can call it the hate debt. The Assyrians, in their quest for total security, had left no one neutral. They had brutalized, humiliated, and terrorized every single one of their neighbors.
They had built their empire on a mountain of hate. In 612 BC, that hate debt came due. The two powers who had suffered most at Assyria's hands, a resurgent Babylon and the Medes from Iran, did the unthinkable. They formed an alliance, a coalition of the damned, united by a single purpose, not just to defeat Assyria, but to exterminate it. The allied army laid siege to the Assyrian capital, Nineveh, the greatest city on earth, a fortress said to be impregnable. When it fell, the vengeance was apocalyptic. The city was looted, burned to the ground, and its very foundations were sown with salt. The slaughter was so total that the Assyrian people, as a distinct political and ethnic group, effectively vanished from history. The fall of Assyria was the most dramatic collapse of all. It was the lesson that a state built on pure terror, however powerful, is unsustainable. It creates the very forces that will destroy it. It is an empire that dies of 1 billion self-inflicted wounds.
Conclusion: the bloody lessons of the cradle. The graveyard of empires. We stand in the ruins of Nineveh, of Babylon, of Akkad. What have we learned? The pattern is clear. Each empire was an experiment, each one a failure. The Sumerians failed by disunity, a people who destroyed their own environment and fought each other for the scraps. The Akkadians failed by brittleness, a military dictatorship that could not withstand the first shocks of climate change and rebellion. The Babylonians failed by envy, a rich, centralized target that invited its own destruction. And the Assyrians failed by hate, an empire of terror so monstrous it forced the entire world to unite and erase it from the earth. What was the ultimate bloody lesson of Mesopotamia? What was the one fatal flaw they all shared? It was a failure of integration. In 3,000 years, not one of these empires ever figured out how to build a stable, multi-ethnic, multicultural state. Not one ever evolved beyond a simple, brutal model of extraction. Whether it was extracting grain from poisoned soil, tribute from conquered cities, plunder from terrified neighbors, or fear from its own subjects, the system was always about taking, not building. They never figured out how to make the conquered want to be part of the empire. They never created a shared identity, a shared benefit, a shared dream. They had only two tools, the canal digger's shovel and the soldier's spear, and it was never enough. The empires born at the dawn of civilization, in the land between the two rivers, provided the blueprint for all future empires. They showed the world how to rise. But more importantly, they showed us, in spectacular, bloody detail, all the ways an empire is doomed to fall. The cycle of Mesopotamia is complete, but the lessons are timeless. Of all the empires we have discussed, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, which collapse do you find the most fascinating? And which of their fatal flaws do you see echoing most clearly in our world today? We invite you to share your perspective in the comments below.